The woman they called the saloon girl was playing piano for coins on a Saturday night when the blacksmith first stood in the doorway and did not come in. Her name was Esther Lowe, though most of the men who dropped pennies into the tin cup on the upright never asked it, and she had been playing in the Silver Bend for 3 months, which was long enough for the town to decide what she was without once hearing her speak. She played because her fingers knew how, because a woman alone in a town like Mercer needed a thing her hands could do. She wore a gray dress that had been good once. She kept her back straight and her eyes on the keys, and when a man leaned too close, she did not flinch and she did not smile. She simply moved her hands to the next song and let the noise of the room close over the moment like water over a dropped stone. The blacksmith was a big man named Caleb Hart, and he stood in the doorway that night with the warm dusk at his back and watched her play for the length of 2 songs before he turned and walked back up the street, and she did not see him do it. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Mercer was a small town, and a dry one, set down in a wide valley where the heat came up off the flats in the afternoon and did not let go until well after dark. It had a main street of packed dust that the wagons turned to a fine pale powder, a general store run by a man named Pruitt, a church with a bell the hot wind sometimes rang on its own, a livery, and the Silver Bend where Esther earned her coins. The town knew most things about most people, and the things it did not know it invented. And the thing it had invented about Esther was that she had come up from somewhere worse and would move on to somewhere worse still. What the town did not know was that Esther had once played in a real parlor, in a real house, before the man she had married took sick and took longer to die than either of them had money for, and that she had sold the parlor and the house and the good dresses one piece at a time until there was nothing left but the part of her that knew how to play. She had carried that part west until the stagecoach money ran out in Mercer. She lived in a single rented room above the feed store, and in the mornings before the heat came on she would stand at the edge of the street where the buildings stopped and look at the pale gold light coming up over the ridge, and then go back and wait for the night and the coins. Caleb Hart's shop sat at the far end of the street, and the sound of his hammer was the first sound Mercer heard most mornings, before the day got too hot to work iron. He was a widower, though the town rarely said the word. His wife had died 3 summers back of a fever that took half the children in the valley with her, and Caleb had buried her on a rise behind his shop and gone back to work the next day, because the horses still needed chewing, and a man who stopped moving in that country did not often start again. He answered when spoken to and charged a fair price and did good work, and that was as much of him as Mercer thought it needed to know. He had heard the piano from the street, and he had gone to see, and he had stood in the doorway and watched a thin woman make an old, out-of-tune, upright sound like something that belonged in a city. He went back the next Saturday, and the one after, and he never went in. He stood in the warm dark with the crickets going in the brush and listened and watched her hands, and then he went home. The thing that brought them into the same room was a horse. It was a Thursday in August, white and blazing, the heat coming straight down off a hard blue sky, when a teamster's led horse went lame, and the man took a length of harness to the animal in the middle of the street. The horse screamed, and Esther, coming down the outside stairs with her sleeves still rolled from the wash, crossed faster than anyone had seen her move and put herself between the man and the horse with her hand up flat. "That'll do," she said. It was the most words anyone in Mercer had heard her say at one time, and they came out level and low. The teamster stopped with the harness raised. "You touch that animal again," she said, "and you'll answer for it." Caleb had heard the screaming from his shop. He came up the street with his sleeves rolled and his arms black to the elbow and the sweat cutting clean lines through the soot, and he did not say anything. He crouched by the horse and ran his hand down the foreleg, and the horse, wild a moment before, stood for him. He worked a wedge stone loose with his thumb, and the horse put its weight back on the foot, and Caleb stood and looked at the teamster, and still he did not say anything. The teamster looked at the big, silent blacksmith and the level woman and the gathered street, and he put the harness down and led the limping horse out of town on foot through the heat shimmer. Esther had her hand on the horse's neck, gentling it, and Caleb watched her hands do that the way he had watched them on the keys. "You know horses," he said. "I know hurt things," she said. "They're mostly the same." She did not look at him when she said it, and Caleb Hart, who had buried a wife and gone back to work the next day, felt something move in his chest that he had thought was buried too, and he did not name it. That night was a Saturday, and for the first time he walked in. He took a table at the back, in the dark away from the lamps, and ordered a coffee, which made the barman raise an eyebrow in a room full of men drinking to cut the dust. Esther saw him this time. She did not stop playing, and she did not change her face, but when the song ended, she let the next one be slower than she'd meant to, and softer, and she did not let herself wonder why. When the saloon emptied near midnight and she counted the coins into her palm, Caleb was still there. He stood when she stood, the way a man stands for a woman in a parlor and not the way men stood in the Silver Bend, and on his way out he stopped near her. "It's a poor piano," he said. "I know it." He nodded, as though she had confirmed something, and went out into the warm night, and Esther listened to his boots on the boardwalk until she couldn't hear them any more. The town noticed. It noticed the blacksmith taking a back table and drinking coffee and not talking, and it drew the conclusions a town like Mercer draws. There was a woman named Hannah Vane who had decided some years before that the moral health of Mercer was her particular charge, and she said it first, on the church steps after Sunday service, loud enough to carry over the heat. A man like Caleb Hart, who buried as fine a woman as ever lived in this valley, sitting in a saloon mooning over a piano girl. It is a shame and a waste. Nobody said it to him plain. But the saying of it reached Esther sideways when Pruitt's wife went quiet at the counter as Esther counted out coins for flour and would not meet her eye. Esther took her flour and walked back to her room through the white afternoon glare and did not let her face change until the door was shut. Then she sat on the edge of the bed and held her hands in her lap, the hands that knew their work, and thought she had better stop the thing with the blacksmith before it became a thing. For his sake more than hers, because he had a place in this valley, and she was a piano girl passing through. So the next Saturday, when he came and stood in the doorway, she caught his eye and gave him the smallest shake of her head, and she watched him understand it, and watched him turn and go. She played badly that night. No one noticed but her. The heat broke late and hard in the first week of September, and on its heels came the sickness. It started at the far end of the valley and moved in along the wagon roads, a fever that put grown men flat in a day, and Mercer, which had buried half a generation 3 summers back, knew the shape of it and was afraid. Doc Mercer was too old to ride far, and within a week there were houses on the edge of town with no one well enough left to bring water to the ones who were down. Esther Lowe walked into the worst of it on a Tuesday morning with her satchel in her hand. No one knew the piano girl had a satchel at all, much less what was in it. The small brown bottles and the clean cloth and the dried herbs and twists of paper, the things a woman learns to carry when she has nursed one man slowly to death and learned every hard lesson too late to save him. She went to the house at the end of the lane where the Coombs family lay sick with no one standing, and she put water on and got the fever down in the children with cool cloths through the hot night, and did the same in the next house and the one after. Mercer watched the saloon girl go house to house with her satchel in her steady hands, while the women who said things on the church steps stayed behind their doors. Caleb found her on the fourth night, asleep sitting up in a hard chair by the open Coombs window, with the child's hand still in hers. He had heard she was walking home alone through the dark each night near morning, and he did not like the thought of her on that road, with the country full of nothing for miles and a fever in every house. He did not wake her. There was a thin shawl on the chair back, and he drew it up over her shoulders against the cool that comes to that high country once the sun is long down, and he set fresh water by her, and he sat down across the room in the dark to wait. She woke near 4 and found the shawl drawn up over her, and the big man asleep upright in the far chair, his black hands open on his knees, and the child beside her breathing easy with the fever broken. She looked at him across the room and did not wake him, the way he had not woken her, and something in her that she had kept shut for a long time opened the width of a hair. When the gray light came, she made coffee on the Coombs stove, and the smell woke him, and they drank coffee together in the still kitchen with the sick child sleeping and the dawn coming pale and warming at the window, and neither of them said anything, and the quiet held, and it was enough. He walked her home that morning, and the next, and the one after, for as long as the sickness lasted, which was nearly 3 weeks. He never asked to. He was simply there at the door of whatever house she was in when the night was deepest. The town saw this too, but the town had also seen the satchel and the steady hands, and the women who had stayed behind their doors had been nursed by her, or had their children nursed by her, and Mercer, which is slow but not finally blind, began to change its mind one quiet household at a time. Hannah Vane did not change her mind until her grandson took the fever in the last bad week, and it went into his chest. Doc Mercer shook his head, and Hannah Vane stood in her kitchen with the boy struggling for breath in the heat, and her pride sitting on her like a stone. And then she sent her husband down the street to ask the saloon girl to come. Esther came. She said not a word about the church steps. She put her satchel on the table and worked over that boy for 2 days and 2 nights, and on the third morning his chest loosened and the fever broke, and Hannah Vane sat down and put her face in her hands. Esther made coffee on her stove and set a cup down in front of her without a word. "I said things," Hannah Vane said into her hands. "I know it," Esther said. That was all either of them said about it. But on the church steps the next Sunday, Hannah Vane said nothing about the piano girl at all, which from her was the loudest thing she could have said. The sickness passed the way it had come. The days shortened. The cottonwoods along the ditch went gold, and the nights turned cool over the warm dust of the days. And Esther went back to the Silver Bend and played piano for coins, because the sickness had not changed the fact that she was a woman alone, with a thing her hands could do and no other way to do it. Caleb came back to his back table and drank his coffee. The town no longer raised its eyebrows, but Esther still shook her head at him, gently, when his look held too long, because she could not see how a piano girl and a blacksmith with a wife in the ground came to anything but trouble. What changed it was the parlor. Caleb had a back room behind his shop where he had stored the things of his married life because he could not look at them in the house and could not throw them out. A bed frame, a wardrobe, and along one wall, under a sheet, an upright in dark wood that he had bought his wife in the second year of their marriage, because she had wanted one and he had wanted to give her a thing she wanted. She had played it badly and happily for 2 years before the fever took her, and he had covered it with a sheet and not lifted the sheet since. He lifted it in the last warm week of the harvest. He spent his evenings that week with the shop shut and the forge cold. He cleaned the back room down to the boards and whitewashed the walls. He brought in the good table, hauled in a stove for the cool that was coming, and ran the pipe out through the wall and stacked dry wood by the door. And he tuned the piano. He did not know how, but he was a man who understood tension and metal and patient adjustment, and he had heard enough good playing to know what right sounded like, and he sat with that old upright night after night, turning the pins a hair at a time, striking the keys, turning again, until the chords came true. He told no one. But a forge gone cold for a week is a thing that gets noticed, and the talk this time was not unkind. It was curious, then knowing, then something almost tender. The whole town watching a silent man build something in secret and pretending it did not see. On a Saturday, in the gold of late October, when Esther rose from the bench at midnight and counted her coins, Caleb was waiting by the door with his hat in his hands. "I've a thing to show you," he said, "if you'll come." She looked at him a long moment. It was past midnight, and the night had gone cool and clear with the stars hard and close the way they get over open country, and a woman did not walk off into the dark with a man at that hour in a town that talked, and Esther knew all of that. She had spent 3 months and a long, hard sickness keeping the town from having anything true to say. She looked at the big, quiet man with his hat in his black hands, and she set the coins down on the piano and said, "I'll come." He walked her down to the dark street and around the side of the shop, the dust soft and still warm underfoot from the day, and opened the door of the back room, and there was lamplight already lit and waiting, and a stove going low against the night cool, and whitewashed walls, and in the corner an upright in dark wood with the lamplight finding the grain. Esther stood in the doorway and did not go in. "It was your wife's," she said. She did not phrase it as a question. "It was," he said. "She played it badly, and she was happy doing it. It's been under a sheet 3 years. He turned the brim of his hat. "A piano oughtn't sit under a sheet, and you oughtn't play for coins on a poor one in a saloon when there's a true one going to waste." Esther crossed the room slowly and sat on the bench and put her hands over the keys and did not press them. She could feel the low warmth of the stove at her side, and she understood what the room was and what it had cost him to make it. And she understood it was not a saloon, and there was no cup for coins, that he was not offering her a place to earn, but a place to be. And she had not been offered such a thing since the parlor she had sold 1 piece at a time. Her hands were not quite steady over the keys. She played the slow, soft thing she had played the first night he came in, the one she had not known why she made softer, and now she knew. The true piano gave it back to her clean and full in a way the saloon upright never had. And Caleb stood by the warm stove and listened to his dead wife's piano sing under the hands of a living woman. And he did not feel he was betraying anyone. He felt he was setting something down that he had carried too long. When the song ended, the quiet held. Esther kept her hands on the keys. "I can't pay rent on a parlor," she said. "I'm not asking rent." She turned on the bench and looked at him. "Then what are you asking?" Caleb was not a man who made speeches, and he did not make one now. "I'm asking you to marry me," he said. "I've a house with no one in it, and a shop that does well, and a name that's good in this valley, and I'm asking you to put your name beside it. You'd play that piano when you wanted and never for coins again. I'd not ask you to be anything you're not. I've watched you a long while, and I know what you are." He stopped and then said the rest of it lower. "I buried a good woman, and I didn't think I'd want to set my hand to a life again. I was wrong. That's all I've got to say on it." Esther sat with her hands in her lap and did not perform anything. She thought about the room above the feed store and the long road west and the man she had nursed slowly to death. And she thought about a shawl drawn up over her in a hard chair and coffee at dawn, and a man who walked her home through the dark for 3 weeks and never asked to, and she found her eyes were closing the way they did when she was tired down to the bone, and she let out a breath she felt she had been holding since the stagecoach money ran out. "Yes," she said. That was all. He did not cross the room and gather her up. He nodded once, as though she had confirmed something he had suspected, and turned and fed the stove a little against the cool so the room would stay warm while she played, and Esther turned back to the piano and played on into the small hours while the night lay still and clear over the valley, and the town slept, and the lamplight held them both in the little parlor he had made. They were married in the church with the wind-rung bell on a bright, still morning, and Hannah Vane sat in the second pew and cried, for pride and restraint both, and Pruitt's wife stood up with Esther because there was no other woman to do it. The whole of Mercer came, the people who had been nursed by her and the people who had said things on the church steps and grown ashamed, all of them in their Sunday best with their hats in their hands, and Esther stood at the front in her gray dress, the only good dress she had and one she would not be ashamed of, and married the blacksmith. When the warm weather came round again, Caleb built on. He turned his patience to lumber, and through the long summer days raised a proper room onto the side of the house, with windows that took the western light, and moved the piano into it himself, and Esther made it a parlor. Not the one she had sold. A new one, with the dark upright by the window and a good chair by the wall and the western light coming in gold in the late afternoons, and a satchel hung on a hook by the door that she never put fully away, because the valley still got sick and still came for her, and she still went. She never played for coins again. There was no cup. There was only the music, given because she had it to give, in a room a quiet man had built for her with his own hands. By the second summer there was a child, a girl, small and serious and watchful the way children are in that country, who learned to fall asleep to the sound of the piano before she could walk. Caleb would carry her into the parlor in the long, warm evenings and set her in his lap in the good chair. And Esther would play low and soft, the slow thing she had played the first night and the night of the proposal, and the child would sleep, and the lamplight would find the window, and outside the smoke would rise straight from the chimney into the warm, still air. On an evening in the gold of a third late summer, after supper, with the dishes done and the child asleep and the last light long on the dry grass, Esther sat down at the piano in the parlor her husband had built, and Caleb came in from banking the forge and sat in the good chair by the wall, and she played and he listened, and neither of them said anything, and the quiet held, and it was enough. Out past the window, a lamp burned low on the porch rail, and the smoke went up straight from the chimney into the dusk, and a horse shifted in the pen, and the warm dark came on slow and quiet over all of Mercer. This was the story of Esther and Caleb, the piano girl and the quiet blacksmith, who found each other in a hard, dry town that took its time before it understood. If it warmed something in you, leave us a word in the comments and tell us what stayed with you. We're always glad you came to listen.